We are good to go. My name is Miles. I am the editor of Makeshift magazine. We look at innovation and ingenuity and creativity across the developing world, as well as any kind of ingenuity in sort of a resource-constrained environment. We're a quarterly publication, and that's sort of what we look at all around the world. Ranges from everything from solutions to water problems to using crowdsourcing as a means to get any kind of social message out, or to get more, organic movement behind a certain cause. And so we look at sort of how innovation comes from the grassroots up. And today I'm lucky to be joined by a few people who sort of practice this in their day-to-day work, and we hope to get some feedback from you and some questions and talk over the next hour or so. So first coming to the stage is Sally Madsen, who is the design lead at IDEO, which focuses on innovation in design, and she is also an instructor at the Stanford D School. And the next person who will be joining me is Statham. He is a recent graduate of Philadelphia University, and he is one of two people, the other who is in the crowd today, Elliot, who developed the Developing World washing machine. And please welcome Aaron. And finally, we have Amy Sun, who works at Fab Folk. She is the president there. She's worked at bringing technology, especially communication technology, to conflict zones, including in Afghanistan. And please welcome Amy.
Thank you.
So just really briefly, not to get into much about myself, but I started getting interested in informal economies and sort of how creativity arises organically living in Liberia, where at the time when I got there in 2008, there was a so-called 85% unemployment rate, which was the stat that the UN and all the NGOs said. And obviously, a country can't work at, with 85% of the people without jobs. So I started looking into, how people had sort of responded to the 14-year civil war and sort of carved out their own ways to make a living in lack of a formal economy that had pretty much been destroyed by a civil war. So that got me interested in that topic, and that's sort of like my background. I now live in Mexico and work there as a journalist, and then work on Makeshift on the side, sort of thing. And talking to Sally earlier in the week, what we were talking about was like how this sort of example of creativity and ingenuity in places where somewhere like Liberia has a ton of NGOs. The UN had a 15,000 person strong mission there, and there's obviously a lot of top-down instruction about how the society can be improved, and a lot of that's very helpful. I mean, obviously huge problems with resources there and infrastructure, and that needs to be helped. But there's also a ground-up thing that's equally, if not more important. And so Sally and I were talking about that and talking about how a very important thing is to going into some of these countries that maybe are recovering from that sort of kind of trauma is looking at the local examples of what people are doing to fix it and sort of build off that. So I was wondering if you could just maybe talk about some examples that you've come across working at IDEO and sort of how that applies to that sort of mentality.
Sure. So I'm Sally Madsen. I work at IDEO, and we do human-centered design, which means starting by really understanding the needs of people and using that to come up with solutions that really serve them. We work in a number of different industries. Personally, I focus in some of our more systemic design types, which are in the social innovation, sustainability, and education space. But as a company, our heritage is in products. We designed the first commercialized mouse, which is one of the things we're most famous for. We also design services and experiences and businesses. So just a bit of context there. When it comes to designing in emerging markets, a lot of times what we're doing is going out and working with local groups and helping them become better innovators themselves, providing them with the support to do that. So an example I can share is a project we did a few years ago called Ripple Effect, where we worked with a number of different organizations in Kenya. And each of them was working on something to make drinking water more accessible to people. So for some, it was a delivery service. For some, it was making more access points where people can come and get water without walking a few hours to pick up their water or paying through the nose for it, that type of thing. And with each organization, it was about really meeting them where they are and providing the design skills that we have, sharing that with them, and then working with the local innovations that they've come up with. And these are really, really talented organizations. So in one case, it's a community-based group in the middle of Kibera, which is one of the informal settlements. And for them, what they have is this incredible community network and the ability to get something done in a politically charged area. And what we were able to help them with was things like, how do you tell your story? How do you build publicity for your business that you're building? And some of the prototyping around that. Whereas for a different organization, the type of support we provided was quite different. So that's just a little example. Thanks.
And a lot of you guys, as I understand, are in university, and Aaron just graduated, I believe, in just May of the last year. And while he was there, he was working on this project called the Developing World Washing Machine. And speaking to Aaron, he had a very innovative and I think very intelligent approach to coming up with this idea of being in school in Philadelphia and coming up with something that is applicable in a developing context all over the world. And to me, it seemed like a very intelligent plan, because he was first of all thinking about, how can I help? And I think that's a really interesting thing that I hope is of interest to some of you. And I'd like Aaron to share a bit of his sort of thought process and implementation process of this project in school.
So first of all, I designed this washing machine that was completely makeshift, involving a few pipes and a 5-gallon paint bucket. And it was designed for the developing world, specifically rural Africa, when we started working on it. So the project came to be because it was a senior capstone project, senior thesis project, and I'm an industrial design major, and normally when you think of industrial design, you think of furniture and things of that sort, and my partner, Elliot, and I, we wanted to kind of focus on something with a little more substance, so we focused on designing for the developing world, and we didn't have the power, obviously, to focus on bigger issues such as the AIDS, everything with like AIDS and health problems. So we focused on something that we could relate to, which is chores such as laundry. No one likes to really do laundry. You don't have to. So, we focused on that, and we looked at the laundry issue in their area, and we noticed that there's a lot bigger problems with laundry than we have from day to day, such as, they have to travel and work on it for 8 hours out of the week, and they could be using that time more effectively to make their life better. So, yeah, that's pretty much.
So our magazine, we have people sort of scattered all around the world. I'm in Mexico. There's a bunch of editors in New York, and then we have a bunch of freelance contributors around the world. And we sort of are always seeking out sort of unique projects like this. And interestingly, about a few months ago, I guess in the fall, we had actually featured Aaron's project. And then so I was quite pleasantly surprised when I got the invitation to speak here to see him on the panel, which I thought was quite an interesting coincidence and really great. And one of the things you just mentioned too was about the freeing up time. And like I said, it's 8 hours a week, say it's 10 for a nice round number. Having an affordable device like this that cuts down on that time, what sort of benefits does that accrue to the local community, to the family, to the actual people involved? Like, what was your thinking behind that, and why was that a motivating factor?
I mean, with the, I don't know, I just felt like it would just help them with their daily life. They could help with their children, because a lot of the times when they did their laundry, they brought their children with them, and they pretty much were working, and the kids were unattended. So it's just, maybe it could help, maybe they can learn something with that 8 hours a day, or, it's pretty open. But laundry is something that you don't really want to spend a lot of your time doing when there's more important issues to be taken care of. So just helping with that.
And so when a lot of people these days, of the last few years, it's become sort of normal per se that you come up with a good idea, maybe it's a bit innovative, maybe it's related to design, technology, music. We put our magazine on Kickstarter, for example, and you sort of disseminate the information this way. that's not available everywhere in the world. And one thing that Amy's been doing is helping with communication technologies around the world in some very difficult places, I think is a fair word to say. Maybe you could explain a little bit about what Fab does. And I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard the word Fab. It's kind of been become very common in the last 16 or 18 years that Amy's been working on it. So can you tell us a little bit about what sort of innovation and what sort of communication technology you guys are working with?
All right, thanks everyone. My name is Amy Sun, and I have been working on this Fab stuff for, I think it's like 16 or 18 years, which is a gigantic number, and it's kind of surprising to say. And at the heart, I want to reinforce that I am a tinkerer, I'm a maker, and this is how I came to this. And we're fortunate, or I'm fortunate in a sense, that making things is something that like instantly is very applicable to solving problems in the world. So to some extent, as an engineer or a tinkerer, you don't really sit around all day long thinking, man, how can I really contribute to the world? But for those of you in the audience who aren't engineering majors, you want to make sure that you think about approaching wanting to help the world in terms of what you're really passionate about and what you like to do. I mean, really what you were doing when you were 6 and 7 that drove your parents nuts, that is what you should be doing, and that's the context that you take out. In the case of the Fab Labs, what we do primarily is make digital technologies or access to digitally enabled fabrication technologies. This is the stuff that is seemingly hard to understand, and it seems like you need this separate population of really smart engineers to do for you. And over the last decade plus, we've been looking for ways to encourage and help bring like close the loop between those people who are the problem sufferers with the problem solvers with the like manufacturers, right, or the people who can actually create these prototypes. And we've seen so many, I guess, innovations and changes along the way. 15 years is just a stunning, I can't believe. Just say that some more. And so one of the things that it turns out I was also very fortunate in that we got a couple of grants to go around the world and just see if people could have access to these capabilities, what would they build and what kinds of problems would they solve, and what types of things would they use. And we went to the weirdest, hardest places we could find in the world, as different as possible. And you know, for the sociology majors, what wasn't surprising is people are generally the same all over the world. We all have to do laundry, and we all really want to talk to our friends all the time, and right, like we want to take photos and share them with each other. So it turned out that there were 7 things, pretty much, that 7 types of things that everybody made, regardless of culture and place and resources available. And we've been really trying to highlight and allow people to share those underlying technologies that allow people as building blocks that allow people to make those relevant solutions. The one that we got the most press about was you can use about, I think it was $30 worth of stuff, this was in Kenya and Afghanistan, to make city-scale ad hoc wireless mesh networks that gives you high-speed internet and VoIP connectivity through cities, and you build it yourself. And most of the people who did that were not engineering majors. They were majors in pretty much everything that wasn't tech. But it was the desire and the need for communications in their areas. So that's a pretty good summary, right?
So how does someone go from not like an engineering background, to being able to be an effective member of a wireless mesh network like that? Like how do you get the skills to someone that, like for me, example, I know nothing about hard engineering. Like how would you go about trying to get me to actually be a functional part of that system, and how has that practically helped in the situations where you've worked in?
I'd say the biggest contributor to a non-technology infused person is, first of all, look at other things that have been done before you. I do come from an academic background, and you keep having to write grants in terms of how is this new and novel and innovative? How has no one ever done this ever before, ever? And I went to MIT, so we like to write things that sound like that. But the reality is, if you look at everything that we're celebrating today, pretty much everything all of you are doing, deep down inside, you might feel like an imposter because you're like, well, I'm not the first person ever to do this because it was done somewhere else. And that's, I think, what we as a group need to change our thinking on is you don't want the newest, neatest, never ever been done. What you want is to build on things that have been done and make them suitable for the context that you're putting it in. So I'd say the very first thing is precisely your magazine. I feel like, it's like we're all set up to be together. Precisely your magazine, where I could look at your magazine and say, wow, I see myself here. I'm not literally this person, but I am these people. And looking for examples, sometimes you have to reach back into history to people who aren't alive. And fortunately, we have a lot of those resources available to us because we are literate and we have a pretty good library of these things. But we're also extremely fortunate that we are contemporaries of each other now, and we have never before access to sharing things that we've done. One of that ad hoc wireless mesh network thingy, we in Afghanistan and in Kenya, all the documentation's in English. And I think 6 months or so after we brought up the entire Jalalabad, or the largest portion of the Jalalabad network, which, by the way, the Afghans did, outsiders helped with 4, they did the other 40 by themselves in the local language. We got a note from someone in Colombia who said, I took your entire wiki, I shoved it through Google Translate, and I built a wireless mesh network in my country, in my language, because I just stuffed the whole thing through Google Translate. And oh, by the way, there's a couple things that didn't translate right. Could you help us with this? So I'd say, really, it's reaching out. Don't be afraid. It is not an I think academics teaches us that it's an embarrassing thing to be building on or copying others, and it's not, right?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true to a certain extent, but maybe not copying entirely. But I think that's a very important thing to consider, is that there's a lot of good ideas out there. And last night at the plenary, there was the example of the windmill, right? And seeing windmills aren't new. I think I don't have my windmill history down perfectly, but they've been around for a few hundred years, let's say. But in that context in Malawi, it was actually a very helpful adaptation to a technology that already existed, and probably the final product was not so different from original windmills, but it actually served a very different purpose. And looking for new purposes in that kind of context, I think, is really important. And you also raised another point that I was hoping to get into, which is the tinkering thing. And you guys have made a big effort to keep everything open source and not put patents on things and let people tinker with them. And so I just wanted to ask Sally, I know that's something that we had talked about, and also Aaron has kept that in mind in his designing, is that not making these products that you were talking about earlier when you first spoke about setting the groundwork for innovation. So maybe not like going in and forcing a product or a specific service on someone, but instead maybe giving the skills for that. And then Aaron, you in your project, you talked about making this basic design, but then saying like whatever works in your scenario, like how take this for what it is and then make it adapt to work with your life, your family's life, your community's life. Maybe you guys could talk about those two ideas, maybe starting with you, Sally.
Sure. So let's see where to start. I'm going to go into that example I gave of working with some water organizations in Kenya. And, I think one of the things that a lot of people do when they design is they have a vision. So we're going to build this water kiosk in our community, and it's going to look like this. And they kind of muster all their resources towards that final thing. And one of the things that the design process is about is, let's build some really quick prototypes. Let's play with small pieces of it and try it. Maybe it doesn't work. Learn why it's not working. Make it better. Make it right, so that we can be sure that by the time we finally build that kiosk, we have a pretty good sense of what's going to work and how we can learn and how we can make it better. So for one group we were working with, they had this novel idea for getting water to the home of every person in their small community as a service. And the idea was to have overhead pipes. Because underground pipes, they figure anybody can hack into that, they can steal water and they would never know. But if it's overhead, then you can see and you can follow it and see who's after you. And the community can look after their resource that they've built. But the big question was, okay, how do we get it to each house? And the idea was, we'll just have these drop points, and from there we'll have hoses, and we'll walk around door to door with the hoses. And so there are some really, really simple ways to prototype that. The first one was just buying 50 feet of hose and walking around with it and seeing what happened, because the environment this is in is very muddy. So that gave us some insights about how we need to protect the nozzle, how we need to deal with the coiling. These are tiny, tiny little lessons, but that building and testing right away helped us get it right when we build it later on.
I was going to pass that to Aaron, but I just thought of a quick, when I was living in Liberia, I was living across from a police station, and it was, chaos, to say the least. But at one point, the Italian government donated something like 40 BMW police cars to Liberia, and they were around the police station a little bit, and all spread out through town. And within, I don't remember exactly, but in a matter of months, there was none of these cars left because they had been destroyed by the roads. And then no one thought of parts, right? Okay, no one in Liberia drives a BMW, or very few, if anyone. And so they were most of them were grounded within a few months, and all of them in a while. And I think that's quite the opposite thing. And I think Aaron also, your design idea was quite the opposite of that too. Is not thinking about these, just big level solutions of, well, we'll throw whatever 50 BMWs cost, like $1 million or something at something and hope it works. But instead, looking at something that, from what you told me, cost $30 to build at Home Depot and cheaper at scale. And so, yeah, what do you see as the difference between those two sort of philosophies?
I don't know. Well, for our project, being from the Western world, we didn't know exactly firsthand what our demographic was, what they had. And after doing a little research, we found some of the main parts of our washing machine they did have, but the little things like pipes, we don't know how readily available it is to them. So maybe they have bamboo or something like that, and it's it works like that. But also going back to what you said, Sally, about prototypes, my partner Ellie and I, we did probably 50 different prototypes of our project, and one thing that we learned was fail often early, and we failed a lot of times with this project. But the thing is, with their final prototype, we learned stuff from our failures. So failure is not always a bad thing with projects like this. It comes back to play an important role in your final product. So just wanted to add that.
This can be for anyone, but I mean, for innovation in general, is kind of skirting a thin line between being a failure, being something new, and just copying something else. So they're pretty intertwined. What do you guys think about that relationship between looking at innovative solutions to problems and the potential of falling flat on your face, perhaps? Open to anyone.
That's a question again.
You want to answer?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking about this a little bit before too, but if you're not doing something a little bit crazy, then what's the point, right? So I think that's something that, you're always gonna, if you're doing something that's actually innovative that hasn't existed before or hasn't existed in that context or in that way before, there should be failures, because that's where you're going to have all the learning, and that's where you're actually provoking really extreme reactions from people, where you're really pushing the limits of technology. As long as you can bring it back to something that's going to work moving forward, that you can implement and scale really widely.
And just to add on to that, I felt that college was the best place to fail. So if you guys are working on these projects, don't be afraid to fail, just because you have the resources to your advantage. You're not going to get fired from your job from failing at this stuff. You're in school. This is the time to learn. So yeah.
You guys must have faced some difficult failure type circumstances working in Afghanistan. Was there a lot of risk or worry about that, and when you guys were building up to working there and then getting into the implementation phase?
Yeah, so I'd say, as a general statement, being undersold, especially as a student, or I was there technically as a grad student, and students, you're just there to learn, and everyone has pretty low expectations for you. You're not NATO or NASA, right? And so to Aaron's point, hiding as a student is actually a fantastic thing, because when you do have a success, everyone is just shocked and amazed. But be sure to marvel yourself, right? Because I think most of us are our strongest critics, because we remember what we had in mind when we started. And the final solution, you feel weird because all these people will come up to you and tell you did a fantastic job, and you're like, yeah, but I failed 49 times and it's not quite what I expected. I thought it would be this big and it's not, and it doesn't go as fast as I thought it would. And so I think keep in mind that all of the things that you see as failures, everyone else really sees as the final accomplishment or a accomplishment, right? So taking time to marvel at what you do, in essence, gives you a different perspective on what you would consider a failure. In the case of Afghanistan, and so I have always chosen to go to the weirdest, hardest environments, not just because it's a conflict area. And for me, again, I come from an engineering background, and there's this concept in engineering where you have a reliability target. So you'll say, I'm building something with a 2-year life or a 10-year life or a 50-year life or something like that. In Makeshift, invention and sort of the appropriateness, especially in a developing context, I think something that's almost a little hard to get out of if you grew up in a developed world engineering sort of formal background is you should be developing for the next month or the next 6 months or a 2-year design cycle as opposed to a 20-year design cycle. Because the most common thing I hear in developing nations is if you wait 2 years, we have this roadmap, right? Like other nations have this aid package, and the roadmap is in 2 years we'll bring something or other here, or in 5 years, or whatever the timeline is. Those sound like completely reasonable things, except when you're 8, that means that when you're 16 you'll have these things, and you don't want to wait, and you would much rather have something that will last a year or 2 that you were involved in, that you know how to fix, that you know how to make better. Then have the perfect solution sometime down the line. So in terms of failure, I actually think we had just nothing but successes because we were designing to a certain capability, and we probably set our targets, I feel, appropriately, as opposed to sort of this image of like the Boston, which is where I was going to school, right? We weren't designing to Boston. We were designing to making something slightly better than it is now.
And one of the challenges, I guess, implicit in that is that, we're in the United States. I think probably the vast majority of people here live in the United States or Canada or in a quote-unquote developed world context. But we were talking about working in a very different context than St. Louis, for example. I mean, rural Afghanistan is a pretty far cry from the campus here, to say the least. Same with rural Liberia, for that matter. But thinking of coming up with solutions and designs from this perspective, it's not quite the same as it's never the same as being there. I mean, everyone in this room, I'm sure, has had something where, like first day of school to going to a new country, you have some image in your mind of what it's going to be like, and you get there and it's like, maybe 10% what you imagined or something. It's never close, kind of thing. So that's a huge challenge when you're trying to design, when you're trying to come up with solutions to problems from afar. We've seen a lot of stuff in Makeshift that's designed very locally, and people identify a problem and see what they have around them within that they can afford, that they can acquire, and then sort of build solutions to that problem accordingly. And if it can't be done, maybe some materials can be subbed in and out, and maybe some money can be borrowed or found from a friend. But there are limitations. And then when you're thinking about something in St. Louis or wherever each of you live, and then you have an idea of maybe where you want to put that into place, how do you sort of square that circle of trying to design for a place that you maybe haven't necessarily been, or if you have been, you don't know very well, and you don't know all the specific small details of is there this kind of glue, is there this kind of pipe? How do you sort of what's your first step from this kind of perspective to that?
Well, for us, we were lucky enough to connect with people from Darfur. They were Darfur refugees, and they were able to really help us with, all right, this works. This would never be possible, kind of things like that. So we used a lot of our connections, and we're able to grow on that. But yeah.
The ideal situation as a designer is you are immersed in context, you're collaborating with the people that you're designing with and designing for. An anthropologist would say spend a minimum of a year to really understand what people are doing. The situation that most of us are in is that might not be the most practical way of doing things. As a design consultant, we can go on research trips for 2 or 3 weeks a few times, but we can't immerse completely. And as students, of course, you may be constrained by the schedules and the timelines and the budgets of being a student and designing for some place that's quite different. So what can you do? What can you do to kind of bridge that gap? I think one thing you can do is find a really worthy project in your backyard, and that makes things really easy. When I was in school, I was designing a solar light for India, and we put prototypes in a box with one of those little disposable cameras from Walgreens and mailed it to India and had people use it, write some notes, take pictures, and mail it back. which was a far cry from actual user research, but it gave us something. It gave us something to work on. Now we have Skype. We have all kinds of fantastic technology, so it's easier to make those bridges. Or find some analogous, say you're designing a light for people without electricity in India. Is there an analogous situation that you could look at right around here? Is it, I don't know, camping? Is it emergency preparedness? Is it homeless people? Like, what is the analogous thing, which might not be the people you're really designing for, but you can learn some things to inform the overall process. So do, just like different strategies to do as much as we can to have that empathy and real human experience that informs design.
I'm just going to jump on the very end of that a tiny bit. Remember that what it took approximately 100 years of development in America is taking anywhere from 25 to 40 years in the developing and underdeveloped nations. So in some cases, when you say St. Louis doesn't look very much like Afghanistan, my undergrad was at Purdue, and I'll tell you that Tippecanoe County looked like Afghanistan, but just maybe 50 or 60 years ago. So one of the best resources was the slightly older population who remembers and who do have the insight of, like, you can kind of sit back and ask, well, if there were cell phones back then, how would you have thought to, because, right, they know about cell phones now, you don't have to teach them about it, and they know about agricultural practices when they were younger. And you can ask those people how they would see those introductions of the what seemingly alien technology, kind of back then. So I'd say another thing to realize is that it turns out the world is a continuum, and people are individuals, but in a lot of ways we are very much the same.
Another thing to add is the projects that everybody's working on now as students are meaningful and very, very results oriented at this conference anyway. It's like, what is your commitment? What impact are you going to have? But I also think about it as maybe the first in many, many projects that you'll be doing. And so using it as a chance to flex those muscles and build those skills with the idea that if you really are into international development, you can go live somewhere, get a job somewhere after school.
So yeah, we're gonna move in over to question and answer with you guys, and I guess feel free to direct the question at a specific person or put it towards me, and then I can move it on to them, whatever you feel comfortable with. But I guess take advantage of the fact that there's some good real world experience here about dealing with some of these projects in a context that maybe you are not familiar to semi-familiar with, and yeah, so we'd love to hear a couple of questions. We'll probably have time for somewhere in the range of 3 or 4. Sam.
Well, I just wanted to briefly say real quick, it seemed like we were talking a lot about failure, which was so cool to hear, because in my profession as a professional athlete, we go through a lot of failure. And even me personally, I go through a lot of failure. And so as I was listening to the people up on stage talk, I was thinking of all the failures that I've been through, from college, even football or academics, to professional. And so I wanted to really just encourage you guys. And we set it up on stage how all these commitments, the reason why you're here, they're all result-oriented. They're all result-oriented. So it's not just a big pie in the sky, a big dream. It's actually providing results that you're going out and you're doing. And so I want to encourage you guys that keep on doing it. Even if you do fail, get back up and do it again. You might fall again, but get back up. One thing they say a lot in football, it's not how many times you fall, it's how many times you get back up. We have a guy on our team for the Arizona Cardinals who's been cut. He's been cut from the team 7 different times. No joke. He's been cut from the team 7 different times, yet he continues to train, he continues to stay ready and wait for his number to be called. And I remember last year he got called up during the season, halfway through the season, then 3 weeks later he got cut. And he got called back up 2 weeks later, and then he got cut, and then called back up in the same year. And so, and I've experienced it myself, even on the football field with failing, on a really big stage. I know a lot of you guys are on big stages as well in your different aspects of life. And so, really, I just want to encourage you guys and kind of piggyback on what we were saying on stage is, not only is it okay to fail, but, it's really, I'd encourage you to fail. You know, I really encourage you to do whatever you can to reach so high that even if you do fail, you know, there's a saying, you know, reach for the moon, worst case you'll land in the stars, right? So reach as high as you can. Even if you do fail, you'll be better off. So I just wanted to kind of mention that because I was really encouraged by hearing what these guys said, and I want to say that it's in every profession, not only if you're going helping international development, but also whatever walk of life you're in as well. So that was my comment. Thank you, guys.
Who's selecting the? We'll go with you. No, yeah, yep. Oh, sorry, we got two people. We can go first the front and then the back one. How about that?
Hi, my name is Etienne. I'm a grad student at Columbia. I wanted to ask you actually, if you could speak a little bit about how you use sort of design thinking and innovative thinking and these cross-sectoral approaches in soft infrastructure, and sort of how you approach your program design or putting your teams together, and because you're not just working with engineers, and like how important that is and how that sort of informed your thinking in the non-physical tinkering way.
I can speak to that a little bit because I've designed a number of services for emerging markets. Is that what you mean by soft? Is not just products, but also other types of designs? Yeah. So, you know, when you design, you're designing some core offer. You're designing, maybe it's a product, maybe it's a service, whatever it is. But then, how is that going to take place in the world? And depending on what type of organization you are, that might be the way that you work with your team. It might be the way that you set up a partner organization to take stuff forward. That type of thing. I think one of the things that's really important is looking at an idea and saying, who are all the different stakeholders that will help this succeed or that will stand in the way, who will find the barriers to that. And really thinking about, for each of those stakeholders, okay, what would I say to them? What would I design for them? And where am I focusing? Where are the hot spots where I actually feel like this is where we can make a difference. This is where we can have influence and make a change. And so one of the things that we're often doing is map it, like literally drawing a map with all these stakeholders and saying, here's where we're going to focus for this part, here's where we're going to focus for this part, and what is the message? And then what are the operations behind that? If it's a product, then you are thinking about distribution and service and awareness. If it's more of like a social campaign, then it's about how the message can spread virally, et cetera. So I think I'm glad you brought that up. I think design doesn't stop at the core idea. It's about what are all the different pieces that are going to make this work in the world, that are going to make this stick.
And just really quickly, not to take away time from it, but just with regards to that, what caught my ear there was considering all the stakeholders, and there's the fear of failing. I think the one thing to keep in mind is with failing is that there has been a lot of aid and development projects that have not fully considered what the potential negative impacts of the project would be. So I think what Sam was getting at was, obviously don't fail in a way that hurts other people, but make sure to keep that in your design. What Sally was just talking about is thinking about what all the potential impacts would be so that your project, however good the idea might be, if you haven't considered all the factors, there could be people that are actually negatively affected by it. So I think that's a very important thing to keep into the full planning. But I think we'll move on to the next question there. Amy, do you want to take that one? I think.
Wow.
It's a very easy answer.
Yes. Right. It's a tough question. I think there's maybe two ways to answer that, and maybe the way to think about it is try to be very clear about what phase your project is in. In philanthropy and a lot of development projects now, there's generally speaking 4 phases of a project. There's prototyping, piloting, scaling, and full-scale deployment or something like that. The kinds of, when it's appropriate to spend you should always think about impact, right? But how much to focus on impact? Well, probably a whole lot less when you're prototyping and piloting, right? And so in Aaron's project with a washer, after he made his prototype, Unilever asked him, well, but could you reuse the water? And I think that would have been a requirement that just would have hindered the creative process in the prototyping phase, right? Because what he wants to know there is like, well, do people wash clothes the same way as me, and do they really care about how it's used? So I think, first step is to really consider, or be really, really clear about which phase you're in. And the question you're asking is a lot more kind of in that later phase, right, where you're starting to think now about scary things like, well, how does this affect the GDP? Are you putting, an entire group of people out of business and concerns or thoughts like that? The short answer is turns out the reason that there's all the other buildings on campus is that there are people who study just that. And make sure, like I think the thing that I did in grad school that I appreciated the most was going to seminars where I didn't recognize the vocabulary words, like at least 3 vocabulary words in the title. Because it helps you understand how to talk about those concepts in the framework that is going to frame how you need to consider those things and how to measure those impacts or how they relate. It is a very hard question. I think the big thing to remember is you don't have to take it on yourself. And more important, it's not just that you don't have to. I think you're far richer for bringing in a wider discussion. At the same time, for those of you in the prototype and pilot phase, those are typically the biggest detractors. They're the ones who say, yeah, but if you do that, negative, 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 it'll never work. So ignore those people first, right? Because in your head, you can excuse yourself for that because you're in those early phases where you're meant to.
And if I could just add one word, I guess research would be a good one, and maybe lots of research from lots of different sources, which is kind of what you're talking about. I think we can just do one more last question. Yeah.
Did you guys hear the question?
The question was how, okay, we can go with microphone, question, repeat.
How would you encourage creative or innovative thinking in those that don't necessarily feel they're academic
You were talking a bit about trying to, create environments to encourage creativity. Do you want to maybe?
Sure. Everybody is a creative thinker. Everybody is an innovator at their core. They just might not feel like that right now. The founder of IDEO, David Kelly, is just publishing a book called Creative Confidence, which is about taking everybody back to the place that they were at when they were 4 or 5 years old, and they just felt like the world was theirs, and they hadn't learned not to be creative. Having said that, there are a lot of people who just feel very constrained by different targets that they're trying to meet or by the way things have always been. And so a lot of times it's about creating a small experience and a small victory that just helps people open their eyes and say, oh yeah, I can do that. Doing an innovation challenge or a design workshop or something can be one way of doing that. But I think also collaboration. If you're somebody who thinks of yourself as a creative person, go collaborate with somebody and really work on stuff together. And you'll pretty soon see that it's not a one-way operation. It's definitely a collaboration, and they're contributing just as much.
We're just going to switch in a second, but just I wanted to let Aaron weigh in on that quickly before I move out of question and answer about, part of your project is about, encouraging people to take your product and innovate with it and make it adaptable. Could you maybe just really quickly just add anything that touches on that?
Yeah, just going off of the whole collaboration, it's definitely a really good thing to do. With our school, we have this design, engineering, commerce, and with that, we were able to connect with other students that maybe have the skills that an engineer can connect with a designer. They might not have, or think they have the skill to be creative. So, yeah, just using the people in your network to go forward and help with that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We're going to switch now and break off into, I guess, groups around the table. And the four of us will be coming around and talking. I believe some questions will be appearing on the screen. But yeah, feel free to ask us anything you wish or anything that comes up, and we'll try and participate as much as we can in the next sort of 15 minutes or so. Right. Okay. We are... Three tables? Yeah. So we're just going to pick three tables to sort of give us a brief synopsis. And if you can keep it kind of short, we only have about 5 minutes for this. So if you could try and keep it to like around a minute, that'd be great. So if there's a table that feels like they are eager to talk, please identify yourself. Okay.
So we spoke about two issues in general. So one of the issues we spoke about was this issue of interdisciplinary work. It's hard for us, especially for me as an anthropologist, not having technical skill to work with those across campus. Now, we were able to create an organization to be able to do that by working on specific projects together with people all over campus, but for others it can be hard. So we had a conversation about that. And then we also spoke about this issue of sympathy versus empathy and where that comes into our design process. So sympathy might be a process where you feel bad for someone, so you do this project for them. But empathy is a process where you really do feel passionate, you understand what the problem is, and you're doing it sort of for yourself, because that's how you feel. And we had a really awesome discussion about that as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Another table? Let's go with the front one here.
So we also talked about two topics. Our first one was kind of looking at the concept of, where do you begin to kind of, align up a bunch of goals like sustainability and, cultural appropriateness. And we actually kind of disagreed on the point that maybe you should kind of begin by aligning a whole bunch of different groups, and then taking all of your goals at once from the beginning. Because if you tack something like sustainability onto a project at the end, it's not going to be a truly sustainable project. So, trying to find the balance between, overcoming the negativity that stops the project from even starting, while still, keeping in mind that there's a lot of very important goals that need to be fulfilled. The second thing that we talked about was the narrative of Western technology versus technology in the quote-unquote developing world, where the narrative now is that you've got this Western technology that is supposed to be, by designers, infused to the rest of the world. And that's kind of inherently, it implies that Western technology is superior, it's something that, should be spread to the rest of the world. And using the example of actually Western versus non-Western toilets, we looked at, a lot of technologies that might be, not only more appropriate for the developing world, but also, have kind of very obvious advantages over, Western technologies. And, making sure that it's not just Western technologies that we're using, we're going to be using kind of a wide range and drawing from a wide range of resources.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we have time for one more. Do you want to go?
Hi, I'm Etienne, now about based in Dubai, and innovation has been a huge reason why I'm doing my MBA at the moment. We discussed innovation in two ways, and that's what kind of tied with what you guys are talking about. We looked at the first thing was it need not be something new. It could be a new purpose which can be created, but not necessarily a new product or a new service. And the other thing we thought was innovation. The challenge is innovation can happen at any level. From a business point, it doesn't have to be just a product. You can innovate it at the distribution level. So it's through the whole value chain. And we also talked about digital innovation, and that's quite challenging, and it's different from product innovation in some ways.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think we're almost out of time, but just the two tables that I sat with, I know that the thing that came up in both conversations was, in a university context, both tables seemed a very diverse group of, backgrounds in terms of, engineering, anthropology, environmental science. And I think that, innovation a lot of the time, and you guys can agree or disagree with this, but I think comes from people from very different mindsets in any kind of way coming together and being like, you know, what about X? What about Y? And then the other person's like, oh, but I saw Z in this context. That's how sort of like, you know, these new ideas start. And, you know, that was, like I mentioned, those were raised at the two tables I talked to, and I thought, you know, that's a very important thing. And school is nice like that, college is nice like that in the sense that you have people studying everything from, you know, microscopic bacteria to political movements to and everything in between kind of thing. So I guess that was the one thing that sort of struck me while we were talking there. But I think otherwise we are out of time. The four of us are going to stick around. I think you guys, I think there's another event that a lot of you might be going to, but the four of us will be here afterwards for as long as you want. And if certainly for me, if you see me later in the day, then feel free to stop if you want to talk about anything related to this. And otherwise, thank you very much.